Lila, for those of you that don't know me, from London Public Library. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Cathy this afternoon, Cathy Gildner. Cathy is a fabulous storyteller, and an award-winning author who did spend 25 years as a psychologist in private practice. Her newest book, which I'm sure she will make reference to today, Coming Ashore, completes her trilogy of memoirs that began with Too Close to the Falls in 1999. And Too Close to the Falls tells us the story of a very young Cathy growing up in a small town in New York in the 50s. That book got great reviews. In fact, it was on the Globe and Mail's bestseller list for, I think it was 172 weeks. Something absolutely incredible, that book. And I read a review of it and thought, this really sounds like something up my alley. I love storytelling. I love books where someone is sharing their lives with us. And I read the book and discovered that the small town in New York that Cathy was talking about was Lewiston, New York. And I actually knew where Lewiston, New York was because I had been born in St. Catharines, and although we moved to Ottawa, Ontario when I was young, we had family who lived in Lewiston. My aunt and her cousins lived there in Lewiston, New York. Now, my memories of Lewiston, New York are nothing like Cathy's. I really don't even have a visual image of the town itself. The overriding memory I have of Lewiston is the getting there. And for any of you who don't know, it's right across from Niagara-on-the-Lake. So we're talking gorge, we're talking falls, we're talking, lots of rock. And the highway was cut, really between rock. And there were signs with pictures of hills with large boulders coming off them. It says, "Watch for falling rock." So my parents would be in the front and I would be in the back of the car, and I would be terrified. I think it's all very well, I can watch for them, but what are we gonna do if one actually starts rolling down? It just tells you to watch, it doesn't tell you what to do. So I would be crouching in the back of the car, terrified that one of these falling rocks might actually crush us. Anyway, that was what I remembered about Lewiston, New York, and of course, visiting my cousins there. And I had the opportunity to meet Cathy at a conference a couple of years ago, and I purchased another copy of Too Close to the Falls and had it signed for one of my cousins who had spent a lot of time growing up in Lewiston. And she loved the book, and she was, could hardly wait to share it with her brother. And it really touched us personally. And then at the conference, I also got a copy of After the Falls, which carries on Cathy's story beginning at the age of 12 when her family moved to a suburb of Buffalo, New York. And, of course, the 60s happened. Yeah. So that was pretty cool. Plus you were giving out those CDs of 60s music, remember? Oh, that was so fun, yeah. And now this book, Coming Ashore, continues the story set in the late 60s and early 70s, and I believe it's 5 years of Cathy's life when she studied at Oxford University, taught high school in Cleveland, relocated to Canada, and studied at U of T. One reviewer called Cathy a magnet for adventure. I think that's such a great way to describe this gifted writer. So let's welcome Cathy here today.
Thank you for that introduction. I have nothing left to say. You covered it all.
Yes.
Right. A reviewer recently called me the first female Forrest Gump. So I thought, wow, there's an image.
Okay, I'm just going to, a few of you have spoken to me about being in writers' groups and that you want to talk about, the technique of writing. And so I'm going to leave a lot of time for questions so that you are able to ask me whatever you want about writing and writing memoir, because I know a few of you are actually doing it. It's interesting because people never like to say that they're writers. I find that so interesting. People trap me in the washroom and say, I'm writing, right? So I don't know why people don't like to ask questions about it, but I'm going to leave some time, and I hope that you will. Okay, I was a psychologist for 25 years, and then I decided at the age of 50 to become a writer. So I wrote Too Close to the Falls. I don't know, have you, a lot of you read that? Oh, okay, great. So, you know, Too Close to the Falls, I was, well, actually, I was a 4-year-old girl, and I used to climb trees every day, and that my mother had to call the fire department to take me down from the tree. I figured, what's the big deal here? I mean, they take cats down, right? I mean, you know, I didn't think it was that big a deal to take me down, but then finally, the fireman said that I had to go and get medical help. So my mother had to take me to the pediatrician. And the pediatrician said, well, her problem is that she has a different metronome from other people. So what she has to do is work. She's got to work full time. And my mother said, but she's only 4, so I don't know who would hire her. I mean, who's going to hire a 4-year-old, right? So my mother said, well, you know, to my father, you're going to have to hire her, because my father owned a drugstore in Niagara Falls. So he had to hire me. Now, interestingly, I gave a talk in Lewiston about 3 or 4 days ago, and that doctor, who's now, you know, he's got a walker and he's about 120, but he said that he totally remembered me, and he remembered that not many girls are, you know, have hyperactivity. I mean, thank God it wasn't called hyperactivity, right? It was just called busy, bossy, and Irish, right? That's all it was called, right? That's what he called it. So he said what he did is, there were some guys in the audience who raised their hand and said, well, I went to Dr. McMahon too, and I don't understand why I had to take phenobarbital, because I don't remember my childhood at all, right? So it was like, wow, that was interesting. And then some other guys raised their hand and said, I got phenobarbital too, and none of them remembered their childhoods. So then I said, wow, why didn't you do that with me? And he said, because it was the era of thalidomide. Remember thalidomide and birth defects, right? So he didn't want to give any medication. So while these guys are like, you know, zzz, for their whole childhood, you know, I got to work in the store, which was actually a great thing for me, you know, because I mean, it gave me self-confidence. I mean, when you deliver drugs, people are happy to see you, right? I mean, so it, you know, it was a great thing for me. And the book is basically about delivering with the black delivery car Roy all over the Niagara frontier. And I think that it gave me a different perspective on life, because I saw lots of things that children really don't see all the time, you know, and most of you have read that, so we won't have to go into the details of that. But then, so the next book, After the Falls, it's, as someone said to me, I didn't like After the Falls because it wasn't as happy as Too Close to the Falls. Right? And it really wasn't. I mean, it was about my teenage years where, you know, the drugstore, the era of the small town drugstore was over, right? It turns into chain stores. Robert Moses built the Robert Moses Parkway, which cut off all of Niagara Falls, which Niagara Falls, New York now is a ghost town, right? So my father just got out in time. Yeah, there's only one restaurant left in Niagara Falls, New York, and the downtown store, you know, sort of like the Eatons was just sold for $38,000 back taxes. Yeah, so it's a total mess, right? And all of the tourist trade for Niagara Falls gets dumped off at the Canadian border, because that's where the Niagara Falls, where Robert Moses Parkway, he built that parkway so that it would go by his power project and not through Niagara Falls. So it was, you know, a confluence of things that were unfortunate. And then when I was 14, my father brought home some medication in, you know, in a vial, and said, you know, take this across the street, they need this prescription. So as I was going across the street, I noticed that there were all kinds of different pills in the vial. So I thought, wow, and I'm used to the drug compendium, so I came home and I looked up all the pills, and they were not all erythromycin, which was supposed to be in the vial, which really frightened me. So I said, you know, these are not all the right pills. These are not all erythromycin. And he said, I know, but hold the vial up to the light. Because when you hold it up to the light, they're so beautiful, all the different colors. So I was like, you know, that was so people say, when do you know your childhood's over? I knew my childhood was over at that moment, because I realized that my father had lost his mind. So I called the doctor, and sure enough, he had a gigantic brain tumor. So, I feel sorry for people that got their prescriptions filled that month, but anyway. Yeah, so that book then is, it's about sort of the loss of my father's sanity, and it's also about me getting involved with the FBI and civil rights, and with the Black Panthers. Then with the Black Panthers, there was a murder, so it went sort of downhill from there. So it was nowhere, it was nothing really like Too Close to the Falls. After the Falls is a really different story. Now I'm back to my third novel, so I think it's back to a much more cheerful story. Which people say they're relieved about. But one person said to me last week, "Why couldn't you have made After the Falls more cheerful?" And I said, "Well, I don't know. I just didn't feel that happy about, the FBI and my father having a brain tumor." And she said, "Oh, I know there is that." Right? So, that's part of the problem with a memoir. You sort of have to follow what's happening. So this new book, Coming Ashore, is about my life in 3 different places. It's about when I was a student at Oxford. Then it's about teaching in Cleveland in '68 when Cleveland was burning. It was the Huff area, and I think you probably all remember riots in, Cleveland, if, well, of course, you're too young to remember even Cleveland, but anyway. Yeah, so, and then the last part is coming to Toronto. And so I'll talk a little bit about that. So I'm going to read a section today from Oxford, but I always feel that I should give people a bit of a prep on why I was at Oxford, right? So I have to go back to age 13 or 14 for that. And my father said to me, "I am only paying for university for you if you become a professional." And we all know what that means. Everyone my age knows what that means. That means teacher or nurse. Those are the 2 professions, right? Everyone's nodding who's like my age, going, "Oh yeah, we know what that, women be a nurse or a teacher." And I said, "I don't want to be a nurse or a teacher." And my mother said, "Well, she can't be a nurse. She has white hair. If she wears white, she's going to look completely washed out." So that got rid of nurse right away, right? Okay, so now we're faced with teacher. I don't want to be a teacher, but I figure, okay, so I'll just do 2 degrees. I'll do them both at the same time. It's no more expensive. You can do a double degree. So I did. And, I have a lot of energy. It wasn't that big of a problem. But, sometimes when, you have exams, instead of having 6 courses, I had 12. So it was pretty difficult. So it's the very first time in my life I ever asked for help. Those residence assistants, they get paid to help people in the residence. I don't know why they get a salary, but they do. So I went to her and I said, I'm feeling a bit overwhelmed. I'm really anxious about getting this done. I've only got 72 hours and I have to write a paper on Paradise Lost. It's 12 books. Like, what am I going to do? I am behind the 8 ball. And she said, "Oh, well, this is easy. You need medication." I said, "Really?" She said, yeah, that girl down the hall who's in business and all those shoe boxes, those are pills. You need a large green pill or you're never going to get this work done. So I thought, okay. So I went and got this large green pill and I said, "But I'm already kind of hyper." And she said, "Do you want it or not?" Right? So I took it, went back to my room, read all 12 books of Paradise Lost, and I totally understand how people are hooked on drugs, because it was great, because I can still recite long passages from Paradise Lost. It just went right in. But I was raised in a Catholic family. I'm the only person who married, right? And I married a Jew and got out of town. But the rest of them are Catholics, and all of my uncles are Jesuits, and all of my even first cousins are nuns, right? So I've been steeped in this whole, religious tradition. So as I'm reading Paradise Lost, I'm thinking, wow, and I come across this passage from God, and God says the snake will forever lose his feet and his legs because of the message that he is forced to deliver about the apple. So then I think, this is very unfair of God to do this to the snake. He's only delivering the message. But because I was on this pill, I became incredibly enraged about this, as though, like I had to defend the snake. So, everything, the volume was just turned up, right? So I wrote book 13 of Paradise Lost in iambic pentameter from the point of view of a paraplegic snake, right? So, yes, and then I handed it into my professor, who was a visiting professor from Oxford. He loved it and said, "You really should come to Oxford." And I said, well, what about the money? And he said, oh, please don't discuss money. Oh, it's so American, right? So I assumed then that he, somehow he was going to find the money for it, and he did. So I wound up going to Oxford. Now, while there, my mother said before I left, please, please, don't do anything awful. We've had the FBI, we've had you kicked out of Catholic school, everything's happened. Please, when you're there, just be, under the radar. So I said, absolutely, I am so sick of, of all the stuff that's happened. Don't worry, Mom, you've got enough on your platter, okay? So I'm just gonna read this little section now about my first day at Oxford. The next morning, after donning half the clothes I brought with me to eat breakfast, I went to let my bicycle in some godforsaken back alley that had no name. Reggie referred to it as off the map, under the first bridge I would meet after taking 2 right turns, not including the right turn I took out of the college. Reggie said to go past the bridge, then double back and go under the bridge, and then between the bridge and the river, I would find a shop. As strange as it seemed, there was indeed a bike lean-to under the bridge. The proprietor had a crooked back, presumably from crouching under the bridge for most of his life. As he handed me over an old rickety bike, I noticed the lifelines in his hands were gray, as though his skin had been tattooed with grease. I rented the bike for a year. I asked if it came with a lock. He replied in a thick Scottish accent that nothing in Oxford had been stolen as far as he was aware. He added in his heavy Highland burr, "You'll have to go to the United States of America now if you want something stolen, won't ya?" I asked if there was a light. Did this microphone just go off? Well, that's not very helpful. Back on? Oh, it must have been my Scottish accent. Couldn't take it, eh? Right. I asked if there was a light. He groused that it was a generator light, which worked when I pedaled. "Now, if you learn how to work, light'll be shed now, won't it?" He began to explain how the bike worked. I rolled my eyes and told him that I'd been riding a bike all my life and I knew how to do it. He said that Americans who think they've invented the wheel often have a problem with English brakes. I rode away while he was going on because he wouldn't stop, and besides I couldn't understand what he was saying. I cycled over the top of the bridge and waved gaily to the old Glaswegian troll under it. He just shook his head as he wiped some oil off his pants, shiny with layers of accumulated toil. I love physical activity, and this bike riding was the best since it combined exercise with transportation. In Oxford, almost everyone rode a bike, no matter if you were 20 or 80. Because you've got to remember, in America back in the 60s, people didn't ride bikes. It wasn't common. You just had a bike if you were a kid, and then you stopped riding it at like 10, and there was no hobbies of riding bikes. So I was amazed to see all these, cyclists. The university was made up of different colleges that were spread around the town, and some were quite far apart. Although you were housed in a certain college, you could have courses in other colleges, so everyone had to cycle. Little old women in thick Marks and Spencer flesh-colored tights rode the bike to the shops. Men with cigarettes perched in their lower lips drove along in dress trousers and tweed jackets and Dubliner wool hats. There is nothing more gorgeous than an English morning. The sunlight sparked off the icy gauze of early morning dew on those crunchy greens. Everything was fresh and clear, and the colors seemed just super saturated. A bracing English morning could wash away all sins, no matter how mortal, from the night before. The colleges all had manicured lawns, and the shops looked Victorian with many small rooms lined in wood, actually just as I'd imagined. It looked like a row of little curiosity shops. I sped along the road, going faster and faster. I decided to go to the post office, which I'd seen right across from Trinity College Gate, and send my parents a postcard to let them know that I'd arrived safely. Actually, my mother had never asked me to do this, but I continued the form as though we were a normal family, instead of one where my addled father thought J. Edgar Hoover was a vacuum, and that President Johnson said no Irish Catholics could drive until the war in Vietnam was over. These are things that we had made up to tell my father, because first of all, when the FBI came to the door, my father, who had basically lost his mind but kept his vocabulary, heard the word Hoover. Right, he put Hoover in with FBI, so he got out our vacuum and began showing the FBI, right, who I think actually wound up feeling a bit sorry for me. And we had to get his car keys because he still wanted to drive. And he had short-term memory loss, so every time we'd turn around, he would be driving up the wrong side of the street. So we finally had to make up that President Johnson said no Irish Catholics could drive until the war in Vietnam was over. And he said, well, that's a really strange thing, but I guess that'll have to happen. I am an Irish Catholic. So we had to make up stuff like this all the time. So we were living in a kind of, alternate reality. At the age of 21, I still loved the rush of speed. I was now going at full tilt, not slowing down for that one-room post office. I was speeding up, planning my stunning dismount at the last second. At the last second, I pressed back on my pedals with all my might, but the bike didn't stop. It didn't even slow down. There were no brakes. So the pedals just spun backwards. Oh my God, the bike mechanic said something about English brakes. Where the hell were they? I hit the post office window at full velocity and flew right through it, shattering the glass. I went airborne past the stamp lineup with a loud thud, came to an abrupt landing against the old mahogany counter. I was bleeding, but I did manage to stand. The postal employee looked at me dripping in blood and said, "Special delivery?" The postmaster came up from the mailroom and quipped, "Americans always want airmail, I'm afraid." And one old woman whispered to another in the lineup, "American, I'll wager, cutting in line like that." The other replied, "They're taught that at home, you know." No one suggested calling an ambulance or a doctor. They acted as though I decided to go through the window, as opposed to using the door just to save time. The postmaster cleaned my arm off with an old cloth used for dampening stamps. Fortunately, it was mostly my coat that was ripped to shreds. There was surprisingly little tissue damage, actually, of just a long brush burn on the side of my face. I had a gash on the top of my head, but my hair caught the blood from that. They gave me a plaster from a rusty first aid box, and that was it. Later, when I went to a doctor in London, he looked at that scar on my head and he said, "Oh, that could have used a stitch or two, but never mind." A local bobby arrived with a legal-sized sheaf of paper in his hand and said to me, "In a bit of a rush, were we?" I didn't realize that the brakes were on the handlebars. Who do you think is going to remunerate the offended party for the window, what with the emergency glass service required and all? "Send me the bill to Trinity College," I said. "You at the college, then?" He inquired, trying to hide his incredulity. "Yes." My head was spinning and I was feeling nauseous from the bang on my head. The two women shook their heads. What was the world coming to if Oxford could let in not only girls, but American girls who drove through windows? "Scholarship student?" asked the clerk, who was now sweeping up the glass. "Well, yes, sort of. I mean, is this pertinent information?" I asked, now seeing double and leaning on the counter. "Gonna be a pretty penny, I can tell you that." I just want to have a little aside here about scholarship student. When I went to Oxford, I thought being a scholarship student was a good thing. You know how your parents say, "Oh, my daughter has a scholarship," and everyone goes, "Isn't that great?" Not so in England, absolutely the opposite. Like, if you're a scholarship student, you're uppity, you didn't come from Eton, and you didn't follow the right process, and you're an upstart. You want to get ahead, and you haven't really paid your dues. So it's almost like when someone says scholarship student, that really means, oh, we know exactly what you're about. You didn't get here legitimately, right? And even, my scout who used to sweep out the room and bring tea in the morning used to say, I'd say, "Oh, so-and-so studied all night." And he'd go, "Oh, he's a scholarship student." In other words, pay him no mind, right? So it's a really big difference between England. It's a very telling difference between England and North America. And everybody that got to know you asked you if you were a scholarship student because they wanted to figure out where you were from. And it's hard with Americans because they can't tell by your accent. So they have to try to really locate where you're from, and that's really important to Brits. By noon, everyone had heard about my airmail delivery. Not one person said anything like, "Oh my God, you went through the post office window on your first day at Oxford?" Or "What an idiot," or "How amazing," or "How hilarious," or "Are you all right?" Nobody. That afternoon, my tutorial included only one bruised American girl with Professor Beach in his luxurious study. When he saw me, he said absolutely nothing about my injuries. He ignored my shut eye, my bruising, and my swollen face. He never alluded to my cranium, swollen to a point on the top, which made me resemble a very recent forceps delivery. He proceeded to discuss Coleridge. I'd actually forgotten about this whole episode, and then I found a letter that I had written describing it to my mother. So I'm just going to tell you a bit about that. Several years later, when I went through my mother's belongings after she died, I found my letter to her describing the post office caper. My mother really loved that letter. She said she opened it in the brain tumor radiation waiting room and burst out laughing. To prevent herself from looking crazy, she read it to the waiting room, and they howled too. It really made me feel good that so many people enjoyed that outing. My mother said that my father loved the story as well, and when she thought he might be feeling a bit down, she would read him the letter. And one of the great things about having no memory is something can be funny again and again. My mother said no matter what the window cost, it was worth it. I did finally receive a bill that amounted to 200 American dollars, which was a fair chunk of change in the 60s and was at least, a month of my dining. When I rode up to the post office to pay the bill, everyone stood back. I approached the postmaster, who said, "It's all taken care of, miss." I said, "Well, who paid for it?" "Compliments of the Queen in the year of the Prince's investiture." "Well, that was really nice of her, given how busy she must be," I said. I had landed with a thud in a truly foreign land. The terrifying thing was they did speak English, so that you could have the false sense that you shared more than you actually did. George Bernard Shaw expressed my sentiments perfectly. England and America are two countries separated by the same language. So that's my first day at Oxford, right? It got a little bit wilder after that. And then from there, I went to Cleveland and taught in a ghetto high school. And it was really a culture shock going from, advantaged Oxford to disadvantaged Huff area. And we had to be escorted into school every day by policemen. There were always big white policemen who took us into school because it was too dangerous to park in the parking lot. And then when we would get into school, there were these people called mice. And the mice were dressed in gray. That's how they got the name mice. And they were all Puerto Rican, so they were little. So they got called the mice. And they had wands, which they called magic wands, which actually were probably tasers. So if people misbehaved, the first day we got there, there was a notice that I got and my friend got, who was also student teaching, which said when students misbehave, never send them to the office. They're frightened of them in the office, right? Because, guys used to go down to the office and break all the furniture, so they had to, buy new furniture. So they were terrified of them in the office. So if they were bad, you just opened the door, the guy came in, the mice came in, took them out, tasered them, and threw them back in. And that was in 1968, and nobody ever heard anything about it, right? So it was, I remember distinctly saying to the kids on the day of Kent State. Remember the whole Kent State thing? Well, it was just a little bit south of where we were. So I remember saying to them, "Wow, do you believe what has happened in America? This is crazy. What do you think is going on?" And they all laughed and laughed and laughed and said, "Oh my God, what a tragedy. 3 white people have been killed. I can't even believe that you think this is a big deal." So I learned a lot being at that school. It was really interesting, and I write in the book about sort of different learning theories, but I won't go into it now. But I hope that you enjoy the Cleveland section. From Cleveland, I go to Toronto, and when I told my mother that I was going to Toronto, she said, "Oh, thank God, nothing happens there." Right? Nothing has happened in Canada in hundreds of years, right? I said, "I know, I am so relieved." I said, "I can't get into trouble here. I just simply can't." So I rented a room on Huron Street, and there were a bunch of French-Canadian guys, which I didn't get along with them at all. And then one night I was sleeping, and I was awakened by police saying that they were interrogating me. And it turned out, this was October '71, they were the FLQ. So I was like, I couldn't believe it. So then, you know how when you're 21, you have an idea that you have rights, but you don't actually know what your rights are? So I said, "Look, I have rights. You can't rip me out of bed until I've had a meal." I don't know why I thought a meal instead of a lawyer, right? So like I was the only person that has ever been interrogated, at Fran's restaurant, right? Anyway, they finally figured out I didn't have much to do with it. So the last part of the book is that I came back, and when I finally arrived back at my rooming house, the Eastern European landlord, who was terrified, absolutely terrified of the police, had packaged everything I owned. And all my 21 boxes of books were on the front porch, and it was 3:30 in the morning. I had nowhere to go. So I was sitting there, having a cigarette, thinking about my life, and along came this really scary-looking guy who said, what are you doing here? And I said, oh, I have nowhere to live. He said, oh, so you're like a street person? And I said, no, I just, I said, then I thought about it, and I thought, actually, I guess I am, because I don't have anywhere to live. And he said, all these books yours? And I said, yeah. And he said, it told me his name was Ginger. And I said, why? Because you have black hair. Usually, people named Ginger have red hair. And he said, because I snap. I thought, oh, that doesn't sound good, right? So anyway, he said, well, why don't you, I live in a Zeus, which I thought was an odd name. And he said, I have 14 rooms. You can have like 5 rooms if you want, and I'll get the flunkies to take your stuff up the street. I just live up the street. And I thought, well, 4 doors north, here I go. I didn't have any idea that that was Rochdale, which was the biggest drug center in Canada, and he was the biggest drug dealer in Canada. So I had no idea about that. But I want you to read about Rochdale and what went on there. So in terms of, it was a very wild life in some ways, and then in other ways it was very. I went to Robarts Library every day and wrote a PhD on Darwin's influence on Freud. So it's sort of running along 2 themes. The last book. Now, I know I'm going to turn it over for questions now, because I know a bunch of you want to ask. And I didn't talk anything about the writing process at all. I just tried to cover the book. So I know you have questions about the writing process. So why don't we turn it over to you guys? Yeah.
When you're doing a memoir, do you change the names of people to protect their identity?
Well, it's funny you'd ask, because I have never had any trouble with my memoirs in terms of lawsuits or everything. But I did write a novel called Seduction about Darwin's influence on Freud, and I was sued by a guy named Jeffrey Mason, who was convinced that he was the archivist in the book. And he's been a very successful litigant, and he sued the New Yorker, and they finally settled. He's going to Supreme Court. They were very frightened of him, and he was convinced that he was in the book, even though I didn't. Of course, I didn't. It's fiction, so I'd made up all the names, etc. So the book never came out in the U.S. Yeah, so that was a big blow to me and my finances, etc. But it came out in Europe and Bulgaria and Russia and 13 countries, but it didn't come out in the U.S. because of that. So I mean, it's kind of ironic that when you're writing a memoir, nothing happens, and then in fiction is where I ran into all the trouble, right? And I don't think it would have happened if it hadn't been him, because he's proven that he'll just keep suing until he wins. But then for this book, I had to have it, I sent it through a lawyer as well at the publisher. And first of all, I put everybody, my family's names, I used all of their real names, right? Because people are gonna know, when I'm talking about my husband, if I call him Jeff, people are gonna know he's Michael, right? So that's just a bit ridiculous. And then I put in all the people I didn't like, I gave them false names. Right? And then, so he said, you can't do that, because then it's obvious who you don't like. He said, so everybody that is not your family, you have to universally change all names, or else change no names. Do one or the other, but you have to be completely consistent in how you do it. And if you're not going to change names, then you really have to talk to all the people and get their okay. So it seemed easier just to change the names, except for those in my family. Yeah.
So it's considered nonfiction, even though you've changed the name.
Yes, that's right. And I wrote that. See, I put all of that in the introduction, and I compressed some of the time things as well, so that I could fit everything in this book, right? So because this is going to be my last memoir, so I wanted to, to shrink things a bit. So I put that in the introduction, saying that that those are the 2 things that I'm changing. Yeah.
Just a tiny
Yeah.
So with doing a memoir, did you go to some of these people and say, I'm going to use your name in my book, or you're changing the name? Like, would they know reading the book?
Yeah.
The question is, did you tell people that they are going to be in the memoir? Yes, I did. I don't know how many of you read the new book. Probably not that many because it just come out. But there's a girl named Margaret Ann in it, and she's actually now a well-known academic and writes in the New York Review of Books. I mean, well-known. I mean, she's like the world's expert on John Donne's religious poetry. I mean, does that make you world-renowned? Or, I mean, it's in a tiny group, right? But she's relatively well-known. So I wrote to her. I said, I'm writing a memoir. And she said, oh, great. And I said, and I'm going to write that whole Jimi Hendrix episode when you had sex with Jimi Hendrix. And she said she never wrote back and changed her email. So I guess she didn't really want me to talk about the Jimi Hendrix episode, which is quite a big episode in the book. Yeah. So she wasn't happy, but she didn't say anything. And I changed her name. And the other people, if you're changing people's names, you really don't have to tell them about it. But I did, as a courtesy, tell most people. And my husband and his family is in the last third of the book. And I write what it is like to enter a Jewish family and what it was like to have my first Passover, which I thought was completely wacky, right? I mean, from 21, from the age of 21, Irish Catholic goes to her first Passover, and first of all, people kiss and hug and say, "Oh my God, I haven't seen you in so long," and they, Irish Catholics don't do this. They just say hello, right? And then I found out they'd seen each other the night before, right? So, and then people argued all the time. People said, I'm going to sell my house. You shouldn't sell your house. What are you selling your house for? And in my family, you would never, if someone said, I'm selling my house, people would just say, that's nice. Nobody would argue. So I just talked about all the different customs and how odd it all seemed to me. And, in Catholic household, it's, if you're going to bother saying grace or saying any prayers at all, people don't interrupt. Right? But I mean, at Passover, first of all, the prayers go on for hours. So, but as they're going on, the grandchildren are saying, Zeta, hurry up, speed it up. It's time for the hockey game. Come on, speed it up, move it. Right? And I thought, he's going to get really yelled at here, right? And he didn't. He just said, okay, come on, I'm going as fast as I can. Guys, leave me alone, right? And his wife yelled at him too and said, make sure everybody wears slippers. Get their what are you doing, Jack? You're not doing your job at all, for God's sake. And I thought, oh my God, they're having this fight. They might get a divorce. It was just terrible. And, he was just saying, oh, don't worry about her. She's just whatever. So I wrote about all of these differences, but then they're alive, right? So, and I wanted them to know that it was the sort of spirit of, I'd written it in kind of loving spirit, but it didn't sound so loving when you're describing these incredible differences. So I sent it to all of them and said, I hope you're comfortable with it. And then there's sort of one matriarch in the family. So they said, oh, give it to her. Whatever she says, we'll go with. And you're always amazed when people want something changed that is so minor, and then yet you're saying terrible things about people, and they go, yeah, no, that's true. That's all true. So I said, well, what do you want taken out? She said, you said my father served no-name scotch. I find that very offensive, right? So, okay, I'll take that out, right? So, I mean, the things that, you will find, in talking about a memoir, in my first memoir, I talked about the Schmidts. I don't know if you remember them, but they lived across the street from me, and I didn't get their permission, but if you recall, she always wore curlers. She hardly ever took them out. Like, I couldn't imagine where she went, because she just wore them all the time, except she took them, they were metal, and she took them out if there was a lightning storm or rain, right? Yeah, and she also wore her lipstick like Lucille Ball, like she had these little lips, and she just said, I think I'll make these up, right? So she just gave herself like a whole new mouth, right? So I wrote all these things, and she came up to me at the reading. She was about 80 now, and she came up to me and said, I have a bone to pick with you, Cathy McClure. And her husband said, yes. I thought, oh my God. So I said, oh, it's the curlers, isn't it? And she said, no, I always wear the curlers. And I said, it's the lipstick. She goes, I like my lipstick. I said, okay, what is it? She said, you said our dog Skippy was yappy, and he's a hunting dog. And the husband went, he's a hunter. They were furious, right? They wanted me to change it in the next edition because I had offended Skippy, right? And they weren't at all angry about the other stuff that I said. So when you think you're bothering people, or when you think you have to check things, you have no idea what people actually worry about. Yeah. Yeah.
I'd just like to switch topics a bit, and can you say something about the mechanics of the writing process? I'm thinking as I'm thinking of this question, I heard Emma Donohoe give a talk, and she uses Scrivener. Do you know Scrivener?
No, I use track changes.
Okay, Scrivener is a program. It's an Apple program, and I've purchased it and tried to use it, but I find it much too clunky and cumbersome.
Yeah.
But it's made for, and besides I use it for academic purposes, but rather than for, it's made for fiction writing.
Really?
So you can put, all the characters, like in certain places in it and so on. But I find it overly elaborate. However, that's just to get me into the question. So how do you keep track of drafts? Do you have a really complicated file system on your computer?
Yes. Well, it's not that complicated,
Okay.
but what I do.
Do you rewrite a lot? Do you?
No, I'm the queen of thinking everything's perfect. Yeah. What I do is, well, it's different for each book. I mean, for Too Close to the Falls, it never occurred to me that anyone would read it. You know what I mean? I just started the first book, and so I just wrote it, handed it in, and it got published. So, I mean, and then I was horrified that I hadn't spent more attention, I hadn't actually worked out the details. It didn't occur to me that, and it also didn't occur to me that people would read it and make corrections. I didn't realize I'm not a fussy person. Like people, I got maybe 15 to 18 emails alone telling me that Ramblers did not have 4 doors. So I mean, people, men love car details. Like they'll tell you, every single thing, and people will correct things left, right, and center. Cisco Kid did not have tassels. All of these details, and people. I mean, I now know that there are sticklers out there, and they are going to find every tiny error you make grammatically and in a 1952 show, right? But I mean, in terms of how I write, I don't know how other people do it, but I find that it's best to just sit down at the computer in the morning and never picture anybody ever reading what you say. Because then, you're not truthful, right? Then, I've read some books on this and none of them were helpful, but occasionally a line is good. One of the lines from Writing Down the Bones, I don't know if any of you have read that, but it's a good one if you want to write. It says, imagine speaking to your best friend that you trust. Just imagine doing that and don't picture anything else. Right? So I'm not a wordsmith. I don't fuss over words at all. But what I do is I just begin writing and I write garbage. And then I think the unconscious is like a pump system. You pump and you get garbage out, and you just say, okay, I'm going to ignore those pages, But I found every good line that I've ever had in any book is always when you're just writing along and not thinking. Just write it all down, just get it all out, right? And then sometimes I look at it and it's too difficult to even read, like I haven't, concentrated at all. And then I find that that's when you'll get, I'm good at spontaneity, right? So if you're not spontaneous, it doesn't work for me. And then I have to go back and then correct it all, And then finally when I probably do, I don't do as many drafts as I should. And then I do maybe 4 drafts, and then I give it to 3 people that I know, who are really picky, neurotic, and annoying, right? So I figure if you give it to them and they, whatever, but they always cut it in half. Yeah, so what I find is to just write. Don't pay any attention to any of the grammar or any of that stuff, because it'll stop you from getting your unconscious out. And I mean, let's face it, nobody cares about Cathy Gildiner. I'm just a human being. It's not like I'm Princess Anne and you want to read my memoir. But so what it is everybody's reading it because they want to find commonality. They want to say, oh, I felt that way too. It's about finding that connection. So if I'm going to write about my life in a superficial way, I did a PhD and I did this and I did that, who cares, right? But I mean, what people want is to say, I felt that way too. And I think the more you get into your unconscious, the more you have in common with other people, or as Jung says, the collective unconscious. You know, so don't pay any attention to that. The other thing, I think one of the things that helped me being a therapist for 25 years is that I found out people all feel pretty well the same. You know, and that people have had you know, everybody suffers shame, everybody suffers humiliation, everybody suffers all of the stuff, and everybody, you know, puts their face on, you know, before they walk out in the morning. But deep down, everyone has pretty well the same feelings. So I found it was relatively easy for me to sort of put those words on the page. And I mean, that's part of what you have to do. You have to worry, but you don't say, I'm going to be judged, because these people have all felt the same stuff. Okay, one last question. We don't have one last question.
Did you get inspired at all by therapy? Was there a bleed through between the therapy and the writing?
No, I don't think so, but somebody brought something up the other day and said, you know what, you didn't get to tell your story for 25 years. You were only listening. You were only listening to everybody's story. And maybe that's why I felt compelled to, you know, tell my story for, you know, because I had to withhold it all that time. Someone said that to me and I thought, you know what, that is kind of the ring of truth. You know, there's something in that, you know. But I mean, having said that about memoir, I mean, going back to your question about it being truthful, you know, I worked at, as a neuropsychologist for like 15 minutes, I don't know. I didn't like it very much because I was in the lab the whole time, and, you know, had taken care of mice, and, you know, I got so bored with those mice, I made them little shorts out of red construction pants. You know, I mean, I just wasn't, a construction paper, I just wasn't cut out for that, right? So, but I mean, I found it interesting. But when we had to go to Sunnybrook Hospital because we had epileptics, and epileptics that had repeated seizures, like they couldn't stop seizuring. So what we had to do is find their aura. Now, you know what the aura is. It's right before you have a seizure, you get a sudden feeling or a sudden smell, or, you know, like Dostoevsky would get a sudden feeling of ecstasy before he had a seizure. And then, you know, you have to know what your aura is so that you can sit down and not get a concussion and break your teeth, etc. So what they decided to do is we wanted to ablate this. We wanted to, you know, to burn, right? We wanted to find their aura, when as soon as they would say what their aura was, we would stimulate their brains in different spots. And then when they would say, oh, yeah, like I had one woman, believe it or not, her aura was Wilma, Wilma, from a Flintstones show, right? So if we could find that and ablate it, they would stop, you know, having all of these seizures. So one of the things I learned from this whole thing is every single thing that you have ever seen, every bad TV show, every Flintstones episode that you've sat through is on your brain, because you can touch it here, and they'll give you a whole show. They'll give you a whole I Love Lucy. They'll give you a whole smell of what everything smells like from every boot to your grandmother's house. I mean, every single thing is on file in here that you've ever done, smelled, saw, tasted, or felt. Like that's why Dostoevsky says just ecstasy, right? It's just that one feeling. So, I mean, when I realized all that, I mean, I guess when you see it, you're amazed that it's all in this tiny head. But when you look at memory, I mean, how many memories do you have from childhood? Not many, maybe 200, if that. You know, when I've taught memoir writing in Banff, and people couldn't come up with more than 30 memories from their childhood. So what we're really doing when you're writing a memoir is you're creating a character. You're actually composing your past, and you're saying, okay, who am I? And I'm gonna pick these tiny things, you know, out of my brain, and I'm gonna create that character, right? And you know, you can get into all kinds of psychological reasons why we create the people we do, right? You know, mine would be the father who said, you know, she's a gutsy girl, she does things, you know, nobody can put her down, blah, blah, blah. We all get positively reinforced for certain things. So the things I remember are those things, right? I mean, I have a patient whose brother was a bad boy and stole cars, and the father was a high school principal. So she was always called the good girl. She was the good girl, and he was so happy that she was the good girl. All of her memories, every one of her memories is of her as a good girl. Right? Because that's what we're taught that what we are. So all of the other stuff falls away. So I mean, when you talk about memoir writing, I mean, you have to remember that you're also creating a character, because you've got literally billions of things to choose from. So what allows some things to break through your conscious mind? You know?
How do you dredge up stuff that's, I mean, you know, when you're going back, like you said, childhood, and you know there's more.
Right.
Right?
Okay. Yeah. That I
You
actually.
have to dredge it. Like, I mean, it's worked.
It's real work. Yeah. So I mean, what I did when I taught memoir writing for childhood is I said, okay, there's 10 developmental moments. Let's everybody write about them. Right. So like, here's one developmental moment. What is the first time you realize that your parents are not always right? It's a terrifying moment when you're like 3, 4, and 5, right? And everybody actually has it in their mind. You know, mine was, if you remember from the first book, was when that guy kept pulling my hair out all the time, and the bully, and my mother said, why don't we invite him to lunch? And I thought, oh, what a loser, right? As if that's gonna work, right? My father said, you should tell the nuns. So I did, and they said, you should offer up your sufferings for the poor souls in purgatory. And I suddenly got this feeling, my parents don't know how to deal with this. I am alone in the world at the age of 6, losing all my hair, right? Till Roy, the delivery car driver, said, you gotta hit him hard with something, you know, and you gotta wait till he's unaware. You know, that's when I stabbed him with a compass, right? And it did all end. But I mean, you know, so like and then I had a lot of people write that out, you know, sort of almost every single person in the class was when they went to kindergarten. Because that's when you're suddenly with other people, and you see that people have different customs, and all the things that you thought were true are just actually customs. You know, I had an Orthodox Jewish woman who took my course, and she went to somebody's house in kindergarten for lunch, and they served bologna and milk, and you're supposed to have meat and milk at the same meal, you know, blah, blah, blah. It went on, and she thought, and you know, the mother said, people that do this will be smote by 3 o'clock, you know, dead, right? So she was terrified that she was 5 years old, and she thought everyone's gonna be dead. Who's gonna pick me up? Like, I'm gonna be surrounded by dead people by 3 o'clock, right? And of course, at 3, her mother came to pick her up, and everyone was alive. And so she said she never ever looked at her parents the same way again, or Judaism the same way, right? Because she realized, hey, what are you telling me this crazy stuff for? It didn't happen, right? And she suddenly, you know, and that's one of those moments when you grow up a little. You say, okay, that's my parents, they've got an idea, but it's, you know, it's just their idea as opposed to this, they're my world, you know. So, and then the other one is the first time that you fall in love, or the first time you have a date, or the first attraction. It depends whether you're writing an adult memoir or a child memoir. Your first crush, all of those things, because they lead, you know, as Freud says, really everything's about sex and aggression underneath it all. So, you know, everybody, when you talk about your first crush, they're all gonna feel, you know, pretty well the same way, you know, except for males. Sorry, Bernie. Yeah, but I actually gave this talk. I'm going to just finish up with this. I did a lot of work for one of the big banks downtown, and psychological work. And so he called me after I became a writer, the head of the bank, and he said, I want to bring every single one of my VPs in from all across Canada, and you can talk about after the fall. So I said, really? Like, I find that odd that you'd want to do that as bankers, like, you know, the FBI, my life. And anyway, he said, so he told me what he was going to pay me, and I said, oh, what a good idea. Great, I think that sounds perfect. So when I went, it was like, you know, 300 men in an audience, and I'm talking about the FBI and my father and, you know, Niagara Falls, and people have these big clipboards, and they're just looking at me blankly. And it turns out he thought I wrote a book about after the fall of the economic crisis. Right? So, yeah. So he was like, wow, right? So it was, I mean, he's the president of the bank. So, you know, it was one of those things where if the president of the bank says everything's okay, then everybody in the audience says that. So he stood up and said, okay, I had the wrong book. So we're all going to have a day. We're going to listen to Cathy. We're going to have a good time. You know, this is going to be bonding. You know, we're all going to talk about, you know, what we did as teenagers. I mean, it was all these men were all in these suits going, you know. But I mean, one of the things was I said, okay, when I was talking about, it says that my After the Falls was my adolescent memoir. So I said, you know, it's the first time that you have a date. Everybody remembers their first date, right? Everyone's nodding. Everyone remembers this. It's written in stone, right? I said, how many people remember their first date? Well, when I ask women this, everyone raises their hand, right? You all remember your first date, right? Not one man's hand went up. Do you remember your first date, Bern? No. I know. That's right. That just means you're a typical male. So not one man remembered it. And I said, wow. I mean, I stopped giving my speech. I was so shocked. I said, really? Nobody remembers it? And then the president of the bank stood up and he said, okay, when is the first time that any one of you saw, the first time you saw a breast? Every hand went up. Every hand went up. So I realized it's just, the unconscious of the male and the unconscious of the female is completely different in terms of romance, in terms of how they approach sexuality, whatever, right? And then there was one man who didn't raise his, he had a walker, he was really old, and I said, what's with you? And he said, does cleavage count? Right? So I mean so I mean it is interesting because if I were giving a talk, I was writing a male memoir, all the males would identify with all of these things, right? I mean, it's no wonder that when males read a female's memoir, they're like, really? This is what you were worried about? Because they're quite different. On that note, I want to thank you all, these masses of people, for coming. Okay.